Good afternoon. I wanted to welcome everyone. My name is George Arnold. I'm a member of the program committee of the Everett Jewish Life Center. The Everett Center is the Jewish house on Chautauqua campus and is our home for all things Jewish. We explore Jewish food, music, politics, anti-Semitism, history, literature, comedy, and on and on. We provide an opportunity to learn, debate, laugh, and explore our interests together. At a time when anti-Semitism is on the rise and Jews are feeling vulnerable, the Everett Center provides a venue for Jews and the larger community to examine some of the very important issues affecting the Jewish community. We are an important community within the larger Chautauqua community. This is the Everett Center's 16th year. It was built through a generous donation by Edith Everett and her family to memorialize her husband, Henry. It was Edith's vision to create a Jewish denominational house with outstanding programs that would be free of charge for everyone and where rooms would be available to house guests. Edith's vision has been more than realized. We are proud that we have a very committed audience and are thrilled to attract new guests. Our audience continues to grow in numbers. Who of you are here for the first time? Put your hands up. That's great. We hope you'll enjoy the program and come back for more. So you can introduce yourself to those of us who volunteer at the center. Almost everybody has a name tag. I don't know where I put mine, but most people are wearing their badges. Our programs include 2 talks every week and Jewish-themed films on Sunday and Wednesdays. You'll find our activities in our brochure. There should be some up front. And also on the screens in this room and on the porch. Our program brochures are by the front entrance, and there are also volunteer and suggestion forms if anyone would like to give some of their time here. We always look for new volunteers. We also welcome programming suggestions. If you have any, please feel free to let us know. Our programs and operations are fully dependent on your donations. We do not get any money from the Chautauqua institution. Your gate fees do not support this center. Your tax-deductible gift helps the Everett Center make ours a home for Jewish thinkers and seekers from all streams of Judaism. It is our honor and mission to develop programs that spark curiosity, intellect, and imagination, infused with our rich Jewish culture and tradition. As our regular attendees know, we offer a multitude of diverse opportunities that explore Judaism through a full spectrum of interests and passions. And to continue our mission to expand our program and to strengthen our community, we invite you to make a donation so we can continue to offer programs without charge. We have some envelopes at the front of the lobby and a QR code form, so if you wish to make a donation, those are some ways you can do it. As I mentioned, there's a cost to everything, so we definitely appreciate any financial support you might be able to provide. Please make sure at this time you check your cell phone and that it's in the silent mode. And if you have any other electronic devices that make noise, please turn them into the quiet mode. So now what you came for, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Daniel Green. His subject matter, he's an expert at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and adjunct professor of history at Northwestern University in Chicago. In 2018, he curated Americans in the Holocaust, an exhibition that opened at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. to commemorate its 25th anniversary. This exhibition inspired the U.S. and the Holocaust, an Emmy-nominated documentary film directed by Ken Burns. I'm sure many of you have seen it. Also Lynn Novick and Sarah Botstein, and it aired on PBS in September of 2022. He has co-edited the book Americans in the Holocaust. A Reader was published by Rutgers University Press in 2022. His first book was The Jewish Origins of Cultural Pluralism, the Menorah Association and American Diversity. It won the American Jewish Historical Society's Saul Wiener Prize in 2012. From 2019 to 2023, he was president librarian at the Newberry Library in Chicago. He's going to speak today on Jewish students and America's melting pot. So without further ado.
Thank you, George. It's wonderful to be here at the Everett Center. It's an honor to meet Edith Everett today. And my wife and I are just having a wonderful time here at Chautauqua. It's our first time, so I think we're never going to want to leave. So thank you. Thank you for hosting us. So as George said, I curated an exhibition on Americans and the Holocaust at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. Today I'm going to talk about Jewish students in America's melting pot. And so let's go back 100 years to 1924. In a 1924 essay called Culture and the Ku Klux Klan, American Jewish philosopher Horace Kallen described a nation in crisis. This is Horace Kallen. He wrote in 1924 that the United States was experiencing a widespread, hysterical taking of stock over the stuff and form of the American being, over what it meant to be an American. This taking of stock, Kallen thought, accounted for the existence of Americanization programs, the nativist movement, and even the Ku Klux Klan's terrorist tactics against Jews and others. Kallen then proposed the idea for which he's best remembered: cultural pluralism. He coined cultural pluralism to make the case that the health of a democratic society depended on its commitment to cultural diversity. The health of a democratic society depended on its commitment to cultural diversity. As Kallen wrote 100 years ago, the alternative before Americans is Culture Klux Klan or cultural pluralism. So Kallen invented this term cultural pluralism to describe an American nation in which multiple ethnic groups could live in harmony rather than in conflict with each other. So cultural pluralism is a theory of ethnic difference, one that envisions the nation as a combination of ethnic groups in which becoming American doesn't mean that you have to cast off your cultural, ethnic, or your religious heritage. This term in 1924, cultural pluralism, was aspirational rather than observational. He was using it to describe the way he wanted to see America evolve, not the America that he saw in 1924. American political culture in the 19-teens and 1920s was increasingly defined by a fear of foreign cultures and foreign peoples. Hyphenation, or being a hyphenated American, an Irish American, an Italian American, a Jewish American, was considered by many to be dangerous to the nation's health. And political and cultural campaigns of the era, especially after World War I, called for 100% Americanism. Here we see a propaganda poster, "Are you 100% American? Prove it. Buy government bonds." This phrase suggested that if you preserve the culture of your own homeland or your own ancestors, you were un-American. So it was a time of fear of foreign hordes, despite it also being a time of Emma Lazarus's poem on the Statue of Liberty pedestal, inviting the tired, the poor, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free, to immigrate, to become Americans. You would see a lot of political cartoons like this. Here's a political cartoon that says, "This is not a dumping ground," signed Uncle Sam, and you see European immigrants trying to get in. One is labeled undesirable. So immigration restriction was supported at this time by the pseudoscience of eugenics, which ranked a hierarchy of races and peoples in the United States, and by a spirit of isolationism in America following World War I. In December 1920, in the context of this isolationism, an international influenza pandemic, and a post-war economic recession, the United States House of Representatives voted to end all immigration to the United States for 1 year. The vote was bipartisan, and it was not close. It was 293 to 41. The Senate did not agree with taking such a dramatic step, so the bill didn't pass. But the Senate was willing to significantly restrict the number of immigrants who were allowed to enter the United States. In May of 1921, President Warren Harding signed the Quota Act of 1921. No one called it the Quota Act of 1921. Everyone called it the Emergency Quota Act. It was an emergency to keep immigrants out of the United States. 3 years later, the U.S. Congress went further. In May of 1924, Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1924, which was also known as the Johnson-Reed Act or the National Origins Act. And this act calculated new quotas which heavily favored English and Northern European immigrants and set much lower quotas for immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe who had made up the majority of the recent immigrants, and not for nothing, that's where the Jews lived in Europe. The act entirely excluded Chinese, Japanese, Indians, and other Asians. The chief author of this Immigration Act of 1924 was Albert Johnson. He was a U.S. representative from the state of Washington in their 3rd congressional district. Johnson was a racist, an anti-Semite, and a nativist. He was the head of the Eugenics Research Association, a group which opposed interracial marriage and supported forced sterilization of mentally disabled. Johnson earned the support of the KKK for his anti-immigration work in 1924. So that's the climate. And amid this political and cultural climate, some people were resisting this dominant tide by claiming that cultural difference would strengthen the nation rather than weaken the nation. And this brings us back to Horace Kallen. Kallen was born in 1882 in Silesia. The area where he was born is now part of Poland. And in 1887, he immigrated here as a 5-year-old with his father, who was an Orthodox rabbi. They came to Boston in 1887. And to his father's great disappointment, Horace did not follow him into the rabbinate. Kallen rejected Orthodox Judaism during his youth, and he continued throughout much of his adult life to really loathe his father's strict adherence to religion and to ritual. By the time he entered Harvard in 1900, Kallen was at best indifferent to Judaism. He earned his bachelor's degree at Harvard in 1903 and his doctorate in philosophy at Harvard in 1908. He held teaching posts at Princeton from 1903 to 1905 and at the University of Wisconsin-Madison during the 19-teens. He actually later claimed that if Princeton had known he was Jewish, he wouldn't have been hired, and he wasn't renewed at Princeton after 2 years. And at Wisconsin, he was dismissed for advocating pacifism during World War I. So after leaving Madison, he moved to New York City, and he helped to found a new school called the New School for Social Research in 1919, and he teaches there until 1973, 1919 to 1973, which is a year before he died. He lived from 1882 to 1974, quite a long life. So while he was in graduate school, in 1906, he chairs the first meeting of a new student club called the Harvard Menorah Society. This is their kind of certificate or their crest. And between the 19-teens and the 1930s, this group, which is not well remembered, spread to approximately 80 campuses across the nation. There were Menorah societies at 80 campuses across the country. In 1915, the founders of the Menorah Association began to publish this influential magazine called the Menorah Journal. And by then, what happened was the Great Depression in part crippled the finances of the Menorah Association, but it was really supplanted on campuses by Hillel. Hillel is founded, the first Hillel is 1923 at the University of Illinois. And Hillel has a broader and frankly more fun vision of what it should mean to be a Jewish student on campuses. But Kallen will remain a champion of the Menorah movement for his entire life. This magazine is published from 1915 until 1962 is the last issue. So the ideas that are central to cultural pluralism emerge from a cohort of Jewish students and faculty members who coalesce around the Menorah movement as they are seeking to integrate themselves into university life. Many of them begin to think about these ideas when they were students in college at a time when there was a growing concern about what was called at the time the Jewish invasion of American universities. And this context is essential to understanding the origins of cultural pluralism in the 20th century because it puts Jewishness back into a narrative where it's too often become invisible, a narrative about American diversity. Kallen and his peers primarily hoped that cultural pluralism would make a space for a renaissance of Jewish culture in the United States. This renaissance would include history, literature, art, poetry, all the humanities. It didn't reject religion altogether, but it insisted that religion did not need to be the essence of a Jewish identity. Zionism was integral to the movement, specifically the cultural Zionism that was articulated during this period by figures like Ahad Ha'am. And those people in the Menorah movement were Zionists, but they never imagined that Jews in the United States would move to Palestine. Horace Callan, in fact, was influential in moving Louis Brandeis towards Zionism during the 19-teens in their conversations and in their correspondence. So this mission of promoting a Jewish cultural renaissance might not sound so innovative to us today, but don't forget the context in which Callan and the Menorah Association were operating. Harvard, where the Menorah Association was founded, was an unmistakably Protestant institution in 1906, as it had been for 270 years to that point. The heyday of the Menorah Association coincided with a rise of anti-Semitism in the United States, unlike any other era in U.S. history. Sometimes now I worry about saying that line. 10 years ago, it would have been easier to say that line. Beginning in the late 19-teens, proponents of the Red Scare portrayed Jews and Bolsheviks as synonymous. The Ku Klux Klan experienced a resurgence in the 1920s. Henry Ford's newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, aided in the reissue of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a forged document that supposedly proved Jews' conspiratorial control of the world. The Dearborn Independent published its own series of articles, which I'm showing you here, in 1920, which they called The International Jew, the World's Problem. Right, so talk about not burying the lead. The International Jew, the World's Problem. Ford's book was translated into, this is a book version that was translated into dozens of languages, and it circulated the globe. Here's a German edition from 1922, published in Leipzig, that was influential on an emerging German leader, Adolf Hitler. So within this hostile climate, the young Jewish men who were associated with the Menorah Association hoped to initiate this Jewish cultural renaissance in America. And they were working on two fronts. They were arguing for an inclusive definition of an American identity, while they were also promoting a cultural definition of Jewish identity to Jewish students. This renaissance would depend on accepting pluralism, on the idea that America is a federation of many nations and cultures together. Now, during roughly the same years that the U.S. government was considering restricting immigration through quotas, elite universities were also considering quotas to limit their population of Jewish students. After years of discussion, the issue burst onto national headlines in 1922 with Harvard at the center. Limiting Jewish students became an issue, especially at elite colleges, because of a perception that there were too many Jews in their student bodies already. So restriction was not preventative. It was reactive to the fact that there were already a lot of Jewish students at elite universities. The Jewish student population at Harvard had increased from 6% of the student body in 1908 to more than 20% by 1922. Harvard wasn't alone. At Yale, the student population rose from 2% in 1901 to 13% by the class of 1925. And I could give you similar numbers for Princeton and Penn and other elite schools. As the news stories broke about limiting Jewish students, Harvard's Board of Governors tried to deflect charges of anti-Semitism. So despite its best efforts, the Board of Governors, though, could not keep the issue of Jewish student enrollment in the background for long. And just 2 days after Harvard released a news statement on admissions, this front page headline in the New York Times declared discrimination against Jews suspected in Harvard policy on admissions. And this is center, page 1. So Harvard's infamous Jewish problem, which would spread to other elite universities, had begun. Harvard's position on Jewish students was shaped by A. Lawrence Lowell, who became president of Harvard in 1909. Here's Lowell. Lowell was skeptical of any claim to pluralism. As president of Harvard, he wrote, "I long ago came to the conclusion that no democracy could be successful unless it was tolerably homogeneous. No democracy could be successful unless it was tolerably homogeneous." He was deeply suspicious of Jewish students' ability to become true Harvard men. By 1922, Lowell had privately identified the increasing Jewish presence in the student body as a problem, and he claimed that it was not the individual Jew who was a problem for Harvard, but it was a critical mass of Jews that would become unassimilable. Lowell wrote to a prominent alum, "To a limited number of Jews, we can do a vast deal of good in making them American. But if the numbers increase largely, they cling together and are affected comparatively little." So the stereotypical portrayal of Jews as clannish rings pretty loudly here, as does a lack of faith in students' ability to socialize or to learn with peers of different cultural or religious backgrounds. After the quota issue makes its way onto the front pages of the newspapers, Lowell again emphasized that quotas actually were designed to help Jewish students. Harvard was not an anti-Semitic institution, Lowell insisted, but because the nation itself was witnessing growing anti-Semitism, quotas needed to be implemented to protect Jewish students' best interests. In public, Lowell would suggest that having too many Jews at Harvard had negative consequences for Jews, who would form what he called, these are his words, an unleavened lump, and would miss out on the ability to socialize with non-Jewish Americans. In private, however, and I've read Lowell's correspondence from the era, in private he worried about Harvard's future if too many Jewish students matriculated. So to deflect the heightened tensions, what do campuses do? Harvard's Board of Overseers referred the issue of Jewish students' admission to a newly created faculty committee, right? The faculty committee deliberated for 1 year, and this special faculty committee that was appointed by Lowell in 2022 eventually denounced his quotas. Nevertheless, Harvard indirectly limited Jewish students' enrollment by establishing new application procedures. The applications that we're used to now in college admissions come from Harvard in the 1920s. They included mandatory interviews. Newly designed application forms required prospective students to declare their place of birth and religious affiliation, and to state their father's birthplace, occupation, and name, including, quote, any change made since birth in your own name or that of your father. So scrutinizing the answers to these questions doesn't necessarily ensure that Harvard could determine which students were Jewish, but the information surely helped, right, in achieving that goal. My family name at that time was Greenstein, not Green. Harvard also implemented geographical distribution requirements designed to accept fewer Jewish students from the northeastern United States, where most Jewish applicants lived. And Harvard again proved to be a trendsetter in American higher education. Other elite institutions, Yale, Princeton, Columbia, Dartmouth, quickly altered their admissions policies to decrease Jewish student enrollment during the 20s and 30s. And these new policies do lead to a rapid drop in the percentage of Jewish students at elite colleges. Now, there's a great irony in these new application procedures, because even as colleges were claiming that Jews would ruin the character of their institutions, these colleges had to go to great lengths just to determine who had Jewish heritage. Many Jewish students had acculturated so well by the 1920s that schools had a difficult time determining who was Jewish without being told by the students themselves. Some students could, if they chose, pass relatively easily as non-Jewish. Horace Callan sums up the issue best, undermining President Lowell and others who claim to be acting in Jewish students' best interest. Callan wrote an article in 1923 for The Nation magazine, where he says that Lowell relies on quotas to mask his own fears about the changing nature of the American nation. Callan writes in 1923, "It's not the failure of Jews to be assimilated into undergraduate society which troubles quota supporters. What really troubles them is the completeness with which Jews want to be and have been assimilated. In other words, it's not the foreignness of Jewish students, but the lack of discernible difference between Jewish and non-Jewish students that frightened those who advocated quotas." So cultural pluralism emerges in response to this focus on Jewish students in American colleges and in response to multiple competing ideas about ethnic difference in the United States. And cultural pluralism doesn't corner the market during this era when we're talking about American difference. Much better known then and now is the idea of the melting pot. The melting pot metaphor resurfaced in America in our political and popular discourse following the 1908 staging of a play called The Melting Pot, written by this man, Israel Zangwill, who's actually not American. He's a British Jew. And here is the cover of the Melting Pot play. The play opens in 1908 in Washington, D.C. Theodore Roosevelt and Jane Addams sit in the front row together on opening night, and they both start to champion the play. It's a melodrama that features a marriage between two Russian immigrants to the United States, One is Jewish, the man is Jewish, and the young woman is Gentile, and they overcome seemingly insurmountable differences because of their experiences in the United States that effectively erase their past, and these differences are insurmountable. After they come to New York, David, the Jewish protagonist, the young Jewish man in the play, falls in love with Vera, a Christian immigrant, and they learn, after they've fallen in love, that her father orchestrated the pogrom that killed his parents in Tsarist Russia. Talk about a melodrama, right? Even their parents' past, however, doesn't dampen their love for each other. So the two still wed during this play. And the moral of the play is that the American melting pot erases cultural difference, erases family history. Love conquers all, but only because that love occurs in America, where all nations and races will fuse together to make this new American. Jewish intellectuals' anxiety about the melting pot metaphor was profound at the time. Newspaper headlines, if you look in the top left here, newspaper headlines in 1909 announced the Jews were doomed because they were going to disappear into the American melting pot. Horace Callan and his peers thought of cultural pluralism as an alternative to the melting pot. Their primary objection to the melting pot was that they considered it anti-democratic. So even as the melting pot metaphor is dominating popular understandings of what it means to be American, and even as hyphenated American is becoming an epithet used to describe immigrants who hold dual loyalties, Callan has the courage to declare in 1915, democracy is hyphenation. This bold three-word summary, democracy is hyphenation, of Callan's ideology effectively asks Americans to reconsider what democracy means in a modern age. Now, cultural pluralism has its shortcomings and blind spots. I'll mention two today, with a particular focus on the second. First, cultural pluralism imagines ethnic groups operating independently of each other rather than cooperating with each other. Callan's concerned with Jews. He's not really concerned with how Jews are going to interact with other ethnic groups in the United States. He frequently uses musical metaphors to explain cultural pluralism in his writing, and he describes the nation as an orchestra in which each cultural group is going to play its own instrument in harmony, but not in unison with others. So the criticism at the time for those who engage with Callan's orchestra metaphor is to ask, who's the conductor? Who's in charge? How can Americans achieve harmony without a conductor? Who's going to make sure these groups play a tune together or try to learn each other's parts? Callan doesn't ever address those questions. Second, cultural pluralism focuses almost entirely on European immigrants and ethnic groups in the United States. Pluralism was limited to what we today would call white ethnics, even as similar questions were being considered by Callan's African-American contemporaries. For example, Callan rarely mentioned his fellow Harvard graduate W.E.B. Du Bois, who we see here. Du Bois was working through some of the same ideas, which he called double consciousness, at the time. In 1897, Du Bois famously asked, "What, after all, am I? Am I an American or am I a Negro? Can I be both? Or is it my duty to cease to be a Negro as soon as possible and be an American?" Callan's asking whether he could be a Jew and an American in much the same way, but he's not citing Du Bois. Callan's failure to acknowledge the similarity of his concerns and those of Du Bois is actually particularly glaring because Harvard philosopher William James was a dominant intellectual influence on both of these men. And we know that Du Bois was well aware of the Harvard movement, the Menorah movement. He spoke at a Menorah Society college chapter at Reed College in Oregon, for example, during this period. So these questions that are central to Du Bois's double consciousness and Callan's cultural pluralism are not identical, but the similarities are strong enough to wonder why Callan didn't write about or even correspond with Du Bois. Now, Callan's blind spot is even more glaring in the case of his contemporary Alain Locke, who we see here. Locke was the first African-American Rhodes Scholar and one of the primary voices of the new Negro movement, which we know now as the Harlem Renaissance. When Locke was a graduate When he was a graduate student at Harvard, Callan worked as a teaching assistant in a class on Greek philosophy taught by George Santayana, and Locke was an undergraduate in that class. Many years later, in 1955, Callan would claim that Locke was present when Callan first used the term cultural pluralism in that very class. And their association also moved beyond Harvard Yard. In 1907, Callan and Locke both spent the year studying at Oxford, where they socialized with each other, as well as with their advisor, William James, who was also spending that year at Oxford. Callan doesn't write as eloquently as Locke, but their essays from this era share similar phrases and similar metaphors, as well as a concern about how cultural groups could remain independent while promoting their own cultures and integrating into American society. This absence of non-whites in cultural pluralism during the 1920s is troubling, but it also reveals how central Jewish culture was to pluralism, and how the Jewish intellectuals who were articulating pluralism were seeking to set boundaries of inclusion in national culture. These blind spots, I think, actually reinforce the idea that cultural pluralism, to some extent, was originally designed by Jews primarily to promote Jewish culture in the United States. Callan will make gestures to the idea that cultural pluralism would be a model for other ethnic and racial groups, but these gestures in his writings are not well thought through at any point. So let me turn at the end here to the mixed legacy of cultural pluralism, and this takes us back to Horace Callan. Callan's ideas about pluralism emerge in large measure out of his training as a pragmatist, as an American philosopher. The Harvard philosopher William James, who we see here, who I've mentioned, is the father of American pragmatism, and he's Callan's dissertation advisor at Harvard. James believed, and pragmatists believe, that ideas needed to be tested constantly to see if they retained their value and to see if they worked in what they called the flux of modern American life. Even the ideas that are foundational to the American nation, they thought should be open to testing. The emphasis on change in pragmatist thought serves to highlight one of the most perplexing contradictions in Callan's writing. In 1915, writing again in The Nation magazine, The Nation published Callan's maybe his most well-known essay. You can see it on the right-hand column there. It's called Democracy versus the Melting Pot. Remember, he thought the melting pot was undemocratic. And in this essay, Callan describes the American nation as an orchestra of ethnic groups, and he pleads passionately against both the melting pot metaphor and the xenophobia of the nativist movement at the time. Yet, in the essay, he treads dangerously close to arguing that biology is destiny. After spending much of the essay explaining the potential for cultural coexistence in America, he closes with this quote. It says, "Men may change their clothes, their politics, their wives, their religions, their philosophies to a greater or lesser extent. They cannot change their grandfathers. Jews or Poles or Anglo-Saxons, in order to cease being Jews or Poles or Anglo-Saxons, would have to cease to be. While they could cease to be citizens or church members or carpenters or lawyers without ceasing to be." Right, so what does this mean? Callan's claim that we cannot change our grandfathers was not an anomaly. Actually, in a 1913 speech, he had said that our identities were guaranteed by what he called inborn nature. He stated the claim even more strongly 3 years later in 1918 when he wrote, "An Irishman is always an Irishman, a Jew always a Jew. Irishman or Jew is born. Citizen, lawyer, or church member is made. Irishman and Jew are facts in nature." So these claims about the relationship between biology and identity have left contemporary readers uncomfortable with Callan. Callan has actually become quite unpopular in more recent decades. Using these passages, some scholars cite Callan when they want to caution readers about the way that we used to think of identity as essential, as immutable, as unchangeable. And there's no doubt that it's difficult to reconcile the claim that we can't change our grandfathers with pragmatist contention that modern life is characterized by change. But we can explain it in part by realizing that Callan was deeply anxious about a particular group, Jews, and in particular Jewish students at American universities, assimilating and losing their culture. And he was looking for a safety net to comfort him in the face of these anxieties. Asserting Jewishness as an essential, inherent characteristic is also a troubling turn for Callan because he was basing his vehement anti-melting pot argument on a denial of any essential American identity. in addition to contradicting principles of pragmatism, insinuating a singularly descent-based Jewish identity should have erased all anxieties about Jewish continuity that underlay the surface of Callan's pluralist vision. If Jewishness was essential, if it was innate, why worry about the perpetuation of Jewish identity? So how do we untangle this fundamental contradiction in the origins of cultural pluralism? I want to suggest that we just stick with Callan for a bit longer and recognize how misrepresentative it is to freeze Callan's thought in 1915 when he wrote this. So if we unfreeze him from that moment in 1915, when he claimed that Jewish identity was innate, we learn that his post-war, post-World War II writings have much stronger affinities with our own current notions of ethnic difference. Now, Callan's age and his intellectual maturity matter. Remember, he's born in 1882. He publishes this article, Democracy versus the Melting Pot, in 1915, so he's in his early 30s. 4 decades later, when he's still writing about this, he understands ethnicity and Jewish identity in a remarkably different way. So keep in mind this 1915 contention that we cannot change our grandfathers, and consider some of the things, some of the assertions that he makes in a series of lectures he delivered at the University of Pennsylvania in 1954. Here's Callan later in his life. First, he says, this is 1954, first he says, among free peoples, most associations are what we call voluntary. They form, change, grow, dissolve at the option of the individuals who constitute them, are creations of their consent. So he's gone from thinking about identity as descent to consent. Next, he explains, even his relation to his family, which he's born into by no known choice of his own, is a function of this commitment. For he can reinforce accident of birth by consent and loyalty, or nullify it by withdrawal from all association with members of the family and the refusal of family responsibility. In other words, we could change our grandfathers, or at least we could abandon our family's attachments and cultural attachment to our grandfathers. By the mid-1950s, Callan had moved away from envisioning a pluralist society as one defined by these coexisting silos of cultural groups determined by birth. Instead, he imagined overlapping affiliations determined by individual choice. And at the same time, he resoundingly rejects claims to identity that are based on biology. And of course, here we're post-Holocaust, post-World War II. So rejecting claims to identity based on biology has become much more mainstream. The post-war Callan understands that the boundaries among ethnic groups are porous, they're not fixed. He describes the commitment to a group or the withdrawal from it as decisions of the individual rather than compulsions of the group. And to consider identity as fixed would be stubbornly dogmatic, according to Callan. That said, so he would have been utterly inconsistent had he refused to describe his own 1915 writing as dogmatic. And to his credit, he does exactly that in the 1950s, writing, "The dogma that we cannot change the past is not an understanding of the process of change, but a prejudice of our resistance to it, and a static illusion symbolizing our fear of it. What else is there to change? What else is the present but the past changing?" Callan revisited similar ideas 6 years later in a 1962 Menorah Journal article in the last issue of that magazine I showed you from 1915, the Menorah Journal. In 1962, Callan is 80 years old. And he used the occasion of returning to the Menorah Journal to reconsider the origins of cultural pluralism when he was a Jewish student in 1906, as well as his own personal history. And here he moved even further away from biological determinism in the essay than he had even in the 1950s. Reflecting on pluralism as he conceived of it as a student, Callan wrote, "At the time, I shared the widespread belief, which I no longer hold, that these differences were rooted in race rather than created as cultures." Callan then reflected on his years as an undergraduate at Harvard. He wrote that he, these are his words, desired to escape the handicaps laid upon one by being known as a Jew when he first entered Harvard. And calling Jewishness a handicap is not a product of some kind of melodramatic hindsight. As I mentioned earlier, when Callan entered Harvard, he found himself at an institution that had historically been unwelcoming to Jews, and he lived in a national climate of increasing anti-Semitism. So Callan then lays the foundation in this 1962 essay that allows him to ask a very difficult question, and one that he likely was not equipped to ask when he was a Jewish student and cultural pluralism was taking shape during his youth. He wrote in 1962, "From my own experience, I knew that my Jewish difference, even if it was only a seeming difference, could and did cripple my strivings for a life and a living." Callan wrote in 1962 that it seemed reasonable as an undergraduate to, quote, "rid myself of Jewish difference if I were able." And Callan declared, "I was able, since, unlike the Negro, I could look and act and talk like the model of my choice. In a word," Callan wrote, "I could pass." So finally he asks himself the difficult question, what then was the point of not passing? Of suffering the lameness that not passing entailed. And notice again this vocabulary that equates Jewish identity with physical impairment, suffering the lameness that not passing entailed. Callan answers this question by seeking to reframe readers' perspective based on the logic of pluralism. Cultural pluralism did not constitute lameness, but strength. Accepting cultural pluralism makes passing anti-democratic. If you believe in a nation of multiple cultures, why would you pass as a culture that's not your own? Pluralist ideals depended on asserting that nurturing cultural difference shouldn't be perceived as un-American, but as the essence of being American. So this renaissance of Jewish culture, as Callan and his fellow Jewish students imagined it, would have allowed Jews to escape from the feelings of inferiority that he had as a Jewish student in the early 20th century. But it also demanded that they not escape from Jewishness. In a society that valued cultural difference, promoting Jewish culture would create opportunities for Jews to coexist with each other within a diverse ethnic landscape. According to Callan, the viability of the American nation itself depended on this diversity. Callan ultimately made a case for Jewish culture in the United States by first asking his readers to reconsider the meaning of American culture. There was no absolute American. There was no absolute American culture. Therefore, there's no fixed norm to which Jews had to assimilate. Only nativists and anti-Semites believed that, and they were sorely mistaken, according to Callan. In this ever-changing modern nation, attributing a fixed meaning to American identity was nonsense. And just as American culture had to evolve continually, Jewish culture needed to remain a living entity and evolve continually. If Jewish culture hoped to retain its value, especially among students, it could not remain static. This dynamism, Callan would continually remind his readers over the course of his life, was exactly what a living Jewish culture requires. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions. So we have time for questions, but I understand for everyone to be able to hear from them, if you hear the questions, if you can come to the mic in this room and ask the questions, it'd be helpful for the audience beyond the room. I can repeat it. Should I repeat it? I'll repeat the question.
Jewish students are no longer going or welcome at Ivy League universities. So I
Right.
was wondering if you could make a parallel.
Yeah. So the question is about concerns about whether Jewish students are no longer welcome at Ivy League universities and other elite universities, and whether there could be a parallel. Look, this last year has been an astoundingly difficult year for many Jewish students on campuses, and one that I think was not imaginable to many Jewish students and Jewish professionals working on campuses until this year. Certainly, it's much more focused. So could we? The question is, could we draw a parallel? I think in the 19-teens and 1920s. What the Jewish students are so concerned about is much more a domestic issue. Questions about, is there some way I can be Jewish and American in this climate of increasing anti-Semitism? Do I need to hide my Jewishness? Can even the fact of starting a Jewish club at Harvard in 1906 felt like a risk to some students. So I've read a lot of the correspondence of students who were involved and students who weren't involved, and the students who were trying to get involved, who wouldn't come, were afraid to go to a meeting of a Jewish club at Harvard in 1906 to expose themselves as Jewish and to think that somehow that would mean that they wouldn't be accepted within a community. I think what's happening on campus these days, as troubling as it is not only there are domestic concerns, but it's also obviously focused on the war, the Israel-Hamas war, and the United States response to it, and Jewish students' response to it. But I think what we've seen on campuses today is really simple thinking about dichotomies rather than more complex thinking that we should be promoting at universities. So dichotomies of white or non-white, oppressor or oppressed, colonizer or colonist. Those are always oversimple binaries, and they work against the mission of a university, which is to be promoting critical thought. But I think we're just not seeing enough critical thought on a lot of universities today. Where this will go in the fall when students come back, I can't predict. But this, while the question of the Jewish students are asking this question of where do I fit in the university, I think the reasons they're asking the questions and the circumstances are quite different 100 years later. There's a question.
Yes, kind of a strange question. Yeah. Do you think anti-Semitism can be a form of keeping us from being assimilated as a population, Jewish population?
Yeah. So the question is, can anti-Semitism keep us from being assimilated as a Jewish population? I think absolutely. I am more and more convinced now, if we're talking about today, although it resonates with 100 years ago, that anti-Semitism is fundamentally a conspiracy theory. It's fundamentally a conspiracy theory, a notion of secret Jewish control of whatever we're talking about, right? Whether it's world politics, banks, Hollywood, pick your poison there. But I think we're living in an increasingly complex world, and conspiracy theories are so attractive because there's such simple explanations to a complex world, right? So the explanation or the answer to complexity, when the answer is it's the Jews, that's a really seductive answer. It's tailor-made for social media, right? And social media is tailor-made for promoting conspiracy theories. And I'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow. If you think about conspiracy theories, think about how anti-Semitism works. Anti-Semitism will tell you that Jews are communists and that Jews are capitalists. Anti-Semitism will tell you that Jews are weak and that Jews control the world. Right? So anti-Semitism, like other prejudices do this too, but anti-Semitism includes its own contradictions. Prejudice is illogical. So how do you fight illogic with logic? I mean, that's part of what the talk was about this morning, right? A hope to counter bad speech with good speech, right? And a faith, I guess you call it, in the truth to win out. And I agree with what Thomas Chatterton Williams was saying this morning about you counter bad speech with good speech. But there is something particular about anti-Semitism where, because it contains all its own contradictions, it can be used to explain pick it, right? Whatever's happening, where someone feels, or some group feels they've got theirs, but I don't have mine, and who can I blame for it, right? So anti-Semitism is not going away, and I do worry deeply that, especially in an environment where more and more people get their information from social media, social media and conspiracy theory fit so well together, and conspiracy theory and anti-Semitism fit so well together.
I really enjoyed your talk.
Thanks.
As you were talking about Horace Callan, my mind went to another Jew at Harvard, but who became ashamed of his Judaism, a very famous man named Walter Lippmann.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is, was there any interaction between Callan and Walter Lippmann?
I don't know. I mean, they were certainly reading each other. The question was about Walter Lippmann, a well-known American journalist and commentator who was also a Harvard man, and about whether there was interaction between Callan and Lippmann. And I'm trying to think back to the research that I did. I don't think I've seen correspondence, or I can't recall seeing correspondence between Callan and Lippmann, but it's a good question. I want to look back, and you would think also that in both of their responses to World War I, that there would have been some overlapping interest there. But Callan, as you said in your question, Callan is going to hold on his entire life. He lives to be, 92. He's going to hold on his entire life to the notion that the way to preserve Jewish identity in America among students and others is to have a vibrant Jewish culture. And Lippmann's going to move, as you said, very far away from that. So in that way, they're not simpatico, I guess.
He was so awful that he blamed anti-Semitism in Germany on the Jews.
Which was right. So the questioner said that he blames anti-Semitism in Germany on the Jews, and there he's not alone. Again, this is part of what I'll talk about tomorrow. But the Gallup organization that does public opinion polling is founded in 1935 or mid 30s, maybe 34. So they're polling Americans pretty constantly about all topics that we're used to being polled on today. And in 1938, when the refugee crisis is really burgeoning as the Nazis are expanding into Austria and elsewhere, Americans are asked whether, the question is, do you think the persecution of Jews in Europe has been their own fault? And 2/3 of Americans say yes. So it gives you a sense of the depths of anti-Semitism. And even during that 1930s and 40s period, as we're fighting Nazism, anti-Semitism here is on the rise, not on the decline, even as we're fighting Nazism.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My question comes a little bit from the discussion and the speech this morning.
Yeah.
Could you comment on the congressional hearings of the college professors that had to resign due to their inability to decry and criticize the anti-Israeli and Jewish sentiment on their campus during the war against Gaza?
Yeah, so the question is asking about the hearings among college presidents, or the congressional hearings where college presidents were called and the president of Penn and the president of Harvard resigned in the aftermath of that first hearing, which was, December or January? I can't remember. January, yeah. Look, in a way, that was kind of a ridiculous moment, right? That to not be able to simply say that calling for genocide violates all the values of a university. And now, on the other hand, so that's maybe not on the other hand, but I think it's also true that I don't think a path. This is my personal opinion. I don't think that limiting speech on campus, as long as it's not incitement to violence, right? I don't think that limiting speech on campus is a path to understanding or is consistent with the values of a university. We should be in universities able to have really difficult discussions with people who disagree with us if they're based on things like evidence rather than on hate. what happened on many campuses with these encampments potentially crossed the line. And I think there was a lot of gaslighting about anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic rhetoric on some of these, throughout some of these encampments, where Jewish students were told that's not anti-Semitic. And I think, in fact, there should have been a conversation. It was an opportunity for a conversation to teach about anti-Semitism. And, we're living in a moment on campuses right now, especially where so much of the kind of education that we get around diversity, equity, and inclusion focuses on the impact of a statement rather than the intent of a statement, right? That the impact is what matters most. And many Jewish students were hearing what was being said on these encampments as anti-Semitic, and then many of them were told, well, that impact doesn't matter because that wasn't my intent. And that is the opposite of what we've been teaching students really over the past, certainly over the past 5 years, but longer than that. So there's an inconsistency there, and I worry when I see those double standards, right? It seems like a double standard in terms of prejudice, the way that prejudice against a certain group is not being handled in necessarily the same way as prejudice against other groups. I hope that universities have spent, and I hope that university administrators spent a lot of time this summer thinking about first-year orientation this fall, right? And it's a real opportunity to reframe a conversation, and as we're talking about what it means to live in a diverse community on campuses, to talk about Jews. Jews have been, I think, absent from that discussion, and anti-Semitism had definitely been absent from a lot of those discussions.
I believe that Brown University and Northwestern have been given some credit for keeping things becoming terribly disruptive, graduation, et cetera.
Right.
I wonder if you could comment on how Northwestern did it and whether you were involved in determining how it would be done.
Yeah, so the question is about Brown and Northwestern being able to basically avoid violence and arrest of students, right? We didn't have violence or arrest of students like we saw at some other campuses around the country. I don't want to call out specific campuses, but I'm sure you all have some in mind. So I was part of, at Northwestern, I was part of what was called a President's Advisory Committee on Preventing Anti-Semitism and Hate. We were working for months by the time the encampments went up I'm losing track of time, but I think in April. And there was a negotiation between the university leadership and representatives of the people who were protesting on the meadow at Northwestern, and they came to an agreement that brought the encampment down over time by June 1st, which Northwestern's on quarters, so we're still in school on June 1st, so it brought it down before graduation. I was not involved at all in any of those discussions. Other members of the committee were involved in those discussions, and then unfortunately the committee itself fell apart over those discussions, and so we didn't issue a report at Northwestern. That's a longer story. I didn't go to graduation this year, but I understand that that some students walked out when the chair of the board got up to speak, but that it was entirely peaceful. And I think that is there. I mean, those are the kind of conversations that we were having, right? If I would never want there to be violence on campuses, and I'm glad, especially against students, and I'm glad that there was not violence at Northwestern. I don't think there should be violence against students. I also don't think people should have the right to disrupt a class or block entry to a lecture, right? If they want to go to that lecture and turn their back on the lecturer or something like that, that's an act of free speech, and I think we should promote expressions of freedom of speech as long as they're not violent or disruptive or stop any other students from learning. At Brown, I have a good friend whose son is at Brown, and when folks on the campus, I mean, we can argue over various phrases that people were saying on campus and whether these phrases are anti-Semitic or not. But when Jewish students told some students at Brown that they thought from the river to the sea was an anti-Semitic thing to say, the students on the campus decided, all right, we're not going to say that anymore. And there was actually a learning opportunity around why Jewish students thought that was an anti-Semitic phrase. I think there needs to be more of that on campuses. There needs to be more real discussion around issues that we disagree on. But I worry that what's happening on campuses right now is just sort of reproducing our political discourse in the nation, where we scream at each other, but we don't really listen to each other. Campuses should be a place where we actually do listen to each other.
Thanks so much.
This will be the last question. Okay.
Thanks so much for this presentation and for taking a more complicated look at the place of Jews in American culture and Callan in particular, who might or might not be proud of the fact that the New York State Regents exam includes the cultural pluralism versus the melting pot as a principle on their state social studies exams for the last 20 years. But in any case,
Wow.
part of what you talked about in terms of bringing critical thought and thinking beyond just a simple dichotomy about Jews' place in American universities and American culture. When we talk about Jewish students on campus today, that I'm glad you're encouraging us to think in a more complicated way about that as well. A lot of Jewish students are involved in organizations where, in their feeling, embracing their Jewish values, are taking part in the protests, in the encampments, and challenging Israel's policy decisions, challenging certain principles even of Zionism.
Right.
And they're doing that with a very Jewish lens. So when we talk about Jewish students on campus and how they're doing, there are a substantial number of Jews on campus who are involved in both sides of this question.
Right.
It's far more complicated, I think, than our current political climate allows us to consider.
Right.
So the question tucked in there somewhere
Yeah.
yes, what would Callan have to say about that? I guess maybe we can handle that one.
Wow. All right. No, that's a great point and a very good corrective. So thank you for that. Right. We can't talk about Jewish students on campus as a monolith. There are Jewish students who are on all sides of the issue. There are Jewish students who are deeply involved in the protests on campus, sometimes driving that. No, I appreciate that. You're absolutely right about that. And I think. What would Callan say about that? I've never tried to map Callan onto this current moment. But he did. I mean, I think one of the points of the talk today is that ideas are not static, right? For him, there's no value to ideas if they're not tested over and over and over again. So if I'm going to take an optimistic or at least hopeful view right now, I think we're seeing significant testing of ideas right now on campuses. I do think that we have to be attuned to double standards. I agree with the premise of your question entirely, but I just think we also have to be attuned to double standards when lines are crossed around where for example, we can protest governments around the country, around the world. We can protest governments around the world. Is it a bridge too far when we then say, and therefore that country doesn't have the right to exist, right? I think if we're going to test ideas, we need to be attuned to those places that there are really significant double standards around that. But we should be open to having conversations on campuses that are much more complex than the conversations that we see in the news media today or that we see on social media. And that's going to take some really extraordinary leadership on many campuses for that to be able to happen. So, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Green.